The Dutch Empire comprised the overseas territories controlled by the Dutch Republic and, later, the modern Netherlands from the 17th century to the mid-1950s. The Dutch followed Portugal and Spain in establishing an overseas colonial empire. For this, they were aided by their skills in shipping and trade and the surge of nationalism accompanying the struggle for independence from Spain. Alongside the British, the Dutch initially built up colonial possessions on the basis of indirect state capitalist corporate colonialism, via the Dutch East and West India Companies. Dutch exploratory voyages such as those led by Willem Barent SZ, Henry Hudson and Abel Tasman revealed vast new territories to Europeans, particularly in the Arctic Sea, North America, in the Pacific, Australia, and New Zealand, with Dutch naval power rising rapidly as a major force from the late 16th century. The Netherlands dominated global commerce during the second half of the 17th century during a cultural flowering known as the Dutch Golden Age. The Netherlands lost many of its colonial possessions, as well as its global power status, to the British, where the metropole fell to French armies during the Revolutionary Wars. The restored portions of the Dutch Empire, notably the Dutch East Indies and Suriname, remained under Dutch control until the decline of European imperialism following World War II. Since the 1950s, the Netherlands has been organized as constituent countries composing the Kingdom of the Netherlands. As of October 10, 2010, the countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands proper, Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten. Origins. The territories that would later form the Dutch Republic were originally part of a loose federation known as the 17 Provinces, which Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, had inherited and brought under his direct rule in 1543. In 1566, a Protestant revolt broke out against rule by Roman Catholic Spain, sparking the 80 Years' War. Led by William of Orange, independence was declared in the 1581 Act of Abjuration. The revolt resulted in the establishment of an independent Protestant republic in the north, although Spain did not officially recognize Dutch independence until 1648. The coastal provinces of Holland and Zeeland had for centuries prior to Spanish rule been important hubs of the European maritime trade network. Their geographical location provided convenient access to the markets of France, Scotland, Germany, England and the Baltic. The war with Spain led many financiers and traders to emigrate from Antwerp, a major city in Flanders and then one of Europe's most important commercial centers, to Dutch cities, particularly Amsterdam, which became Europe's foremost center for shipping, banking, and insurance. Efficient access to capital enabled the Dutch in the 1580s to extend their trade routes beyond northern Europe to new markets in the Mediterranean and the Levant. In the 1590s, Dutch ships began to trade with Brazil and the Dutch Gold Coast of Africa, and towards the Indian Ocean and the source of the lucrative spice trade. This brought the Dutch into direct competition with Portugal, which had dominated these trade routes for several decades, and had established colonial outposts on the coasts of Brazil, Africa and the Indian Ocean to facilitate them. The rivalry with Portugal, however, was not entirely economic. From 1580, after the death of the King of Portugal, Sebastian I, and much of the Portuguese nobility in the Battle of Alcácer-Quibir, the Portuguese crown had been joined to that of Spain in an Iberian Union, under the heir of Emperor Charles V, Philip II of Spain. By attacking Portuguese overseas possessions, the Dutch forced Spain to divert financial and military resources away from its attempt to quell Dutch independence. Thus began the several-decade-long Dutch-Portuguese War. In 1594, the Compagnie van Ver was founded in Amsterdam, with the aim of sending 2 fleets to the Spice Islands of Maluku. The first fleet sailed in 1596 and returned in 1597 with a cargo of pepper, which more than covered the costs of the voyage. The second voyage returned its investors a 400% profit. The success of these voyages led to the founding of a number of companies competing for the trade. The competition was counterproductive to the company's interests as it threatened to drive up the price of spices at their source in Indonesia, whilst driving them down in Europe. Rise of Dutch hegemony. As a result of the problems caused by intercompany rivalry, the Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602. The charter awarded to the company by the States General granted it sole rights, for an initial period of 21 years, to Dutch trade and navigation east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. The directors of the company, the Heeren 17, were given the legal authority to establish fortresses and strongholds, to sign treaties, to enlist both an army and a navy, and to wage defensive war. The company itself was founded as a joint stock company, similarly to its English rival that had been founded 2 years earlier, the English East India Company. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was set up and given a 25-year monopoly to those parts of the world not controlled by its East India counterpart: the Atlantic, the Americas and the west coast of Africa. Philippine-Dutch conflicts. The Spanish-Dutch War was for the Dutch part of their struggle for independence and religious freedom. During the 80 Years' War, it was largely fought on the European continent, but war was also conducted against Philippi's overseas territories, including Spanish colonies and the Portuguese metropoles, colonies, trading posts and forts belonging at that time to the King of Spain and Portugal. The Netherlands became part of the domains of the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty when Emperor Charles V divided the holdings of the Habsburg Empire following his abdication in 1555. In 1566, the Dutch revolt erupted, and in 1568 the Dutch Republic embarked on the long, tortuous path of the 80 Years' War and began the invasion and looting of Spanish colonies in the Americas and of Asia, including an attempted invasion of the Philippines. From 1517, the port of Lisbon in Portugal was the main European market for products from India that was attended by other nations to purchase their needs. But as a result of Portugal's incorporation in the Iberian Union with Spain by Philip II in 1580, all Portuguese territories were thereafter Spanish Habsburg branch territory, and thus all Portuguese markets were closed to the United Provinces. Thus, in 1595, the Dutch decided to set sail on their own to acquire products for themselves, making use of the secret knowledge of the Portuguese trade routes, which Cornelis de Houtman had managed to acquire in Lisbon. Pursuing their quest for alternative routes to Asia for trade, the Dutch were disrupting the Spanish-Portuguese trade, and they eventually ranged as far afield as the Philippines. The Dutch sought to dominate the commercial sea trade in Southeast Asia, going so far in pursuit of this goal as to engage in what other nations and powers considered to be little more than piratical activities. The joining of the two crowns deprived Portugal of a separate foreign policy, with King Philip II's enemies becoming Portugal's enemies as well. War with the Dutch led to attacks on most of Portugal's far-flung trading network in and around Asia, including Ceylon and Goa, as well as attacks upon her commercial interests in Japan, Africa, and South America. Even though the Portuguese had never been able to capture the entire island of Ceylon, they had been able to keep the coastal regions under their control for a considerable time before the coming of the Dutch in war. Portugal's South American colony, Brazil, was partially conquered by both France and the United Provinces. In the 17th century, the grand design of the West India Company involved attempting to corner the international trade in sugar by attacking Portuguese colonies in Brazil and Africa, seizing both the sugarcane plantations and the slave ports needed to resupply their labor. Although weakened by the Iberian Union with Spain, whose attention was focused elsewhere, the Portuguese were able to fight off the initial assault before the Battle of Matanzas Bay provided the weak with the funds needed for a successful operation. Johan Maurits was appointed governor of New Holland, and landed at Recife in January of 1637. In a series of successful expeditions, he gradually extended the Dutch possessions from Sergipe on the south to Maranhão in the north. The week also succeeded in conquering Gori, Elmina Castle, St. Thomas, and Luanda on the west coast of Africa. Both regions were also used as bases for Dutch privateers plundering Portuguese and Spanish trade routes. The dissolution of the Iberian Union in 1640 and Maurits's recall in 1643 led to increased resistance from the Portuguese colonists, who still made up a majority of the Brazilian settlers. The Dutch were finally overcome during the 1650s, but managed to receive 4 million reis in exchange for extinguishing their claims over Brazil in the 1661 Treaty of The Hague. Asia war between Philippi's possessions and other countries led to a deterioration of Portugal's empire, as with the loss of Hormuz to England, but the Dutch Empire was the main beneficiary. The VOC began immediately to prize away the string of coastal fortresses that, at the time, comprised the Portuguese Empire. The settlements were isolated, difficult to reinforce if attacked, and prone to being picked off one by one. But nevertheless the Dutch only enjoyed mixed success in its attempts to do so. Amboina was captured from the Portuguese in 1605, but an attack on Malacca the following year narrowly failed in its objective to provide a more strategically located base in the East Indies with favorable monsoon winds. The Dutch found what they were looking for in Jakarta, conquered by Jan Coen in 1619. Later renamed Batavia after the putative Dutch ancestors, the Batavians, and which would become the capital of the Dutch East Indies. Meanwhile, the Dutch continued to drive out the Portuguese from their bases in Asia. Malacca finally succumbed in 1641, Colombo in 1656, Ceylon in 1658, Nagapattinam in 1662, and Cranganore and Kochi in 1662. Goa, the capital of the Portuguese Empire in the east, was unsuccessfully attacked by the Dutch in 1603 and 1610. Whilst the Dutch were unable in 4 attempts to capture Macau, from where Portugal monopolized the lucrative China-Japan trade, the Japanese shogunate's increasing suspicion of the intentions of the Catholic Portuguese led to their expulsion in 1639. Under the subsequent Sakoku policy, from 1639 till 1854, the Dutch were the only European power allowed to operate in Japan. Confined in 1639 to Arado and then from 1641 at Tsushima. In the mid-17th century the Dutch also explored the western Australian coasts, naming many places. The Dutch colonized Mauritius in 1638. Several decades after 3 ships out of the Dutch Second Fleet sent to the Spice Islands were blown off course in a storm and landed in 1598. They named it in honor of Prince Maurice of Nassau, the stadtholder of the Netherlands. The Dutch found the climate hostile and abandoned the island after several further decades. The Dutch established a colony at Taiyuan, in the south of Taiwan, an island then largely dominated by Portuguese traders and known as Formosa, and in 1642 the Dutch took northern Formosa from the Spanish by force. In 1646, the Dutch tried to take the Spanish colony in the Philippines. The Dutch had a large force at their disposal, but when they tried to take Manila, they were defeated at the battles of La Naval de Manila. After this defeat, the Dutch abandoned their efforts to take Manila in the Philippines. Between 1602 and 1796, the VOC sent almost 1 million Europeans to work in the Asia trade. The majority died of disease or made their way back to Europe, but some of them made the Indies their new home. Interaction between the Dutch and native population mainly took place in Sri Lanka and the modern Indonesian islands. Through the centuries there developed a relatively large Dutch-speaking population of mixed Dutch and Indonesian descent, known as Indos or Dutch Indonesians. Americas in the Atlantic, the West India Company concentrated on wresting from Portugal its grip on the sugar and slave trade. and on opportunistic attacks on the Spanish treasure fleets on their homeward-bound voyage. Bahia on the northeast coast of Brazil was captured in 1624 but only held for a year before it was recaptured by a joint Spanish-Portuguese expedition. In 1628, Piet Hein captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet, and made off with a vast fortune in precious metals and goods that enabled the company 2 years later to pay its shareholders a cash dividend of 70%. Though the company was to have relatively few other successes against the Spanish. In 1630, the Dutch occupied the Portuguese sugar settlement of Pernambuco and over the next few years pushed inland, annexing the sugar plantations that surrounded it. In order to supply the plantations with the manpower they required, a successful expedition was launched in 1637 from Brazil to capture the Portuguese slaving post of Elmina, and in 1641 successfully captured the Portuguese settlements in Angola. In 1642, the Dutch captured the Portuguese possession of Axum in Africa. By 1650, the West India Company was firmly in control of both the sugar and slave trades, and had occupied the Caribbean islands of Sint Maarten, Curaçao, Aruba and Bonaire in order to guarantee access to the island's salt pans. Unlike in Asia, Dutch successes against the Portuguese in Brazil and Africa were short-lived. Years of settlement had left large Portuguese communities under the rule of the Dutch, who were by nature traders rather than colonizers. In 1645, the Portuguese community at Pernambuco rebelled against their Dutch masters, and by 1654, the Dutch had been ousted from Brazil. In the intervening years, a Portuguese expedition had been sent from Brazil to recapture Luanda in Angola. By 1648, the Dutch were expelled from there also. On the northeast coast of North America, the West India Company took over a settlement that had been established by the Company of New Netherland at Fort Orange at Albany on the Hudson River, relocated from Fort Nassau, which had been founded in 1614. The Dutch had been sending ships annually to the Hudson River to trade fur since Henry Hudson's voyage of 1609. To protect its precarious position at Albany from the nearby English and French, the company founded the fortified town of New Amsterdam in 1625, at the mouth of the Hudson, encouraging settlement of the surrounding areas of Long Island and New Jersey. The fur trade ultimately proved impossible for the company to monopolize due to the massive illegal private trade in furs, and the settlement of New Netherland was unprofitable. In 1655, the nearby colony of New Sweden on the Delaware River was forcibly absorbed into New Netherland after ships and soldiers were sent to capture it by the Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant. Since its inception, the Dutch East India Company had been in competition with its counterpart, the English East India Company, founded 2 years earlier but with a capital base 8 times smaller, for the same goods and markets in the East. In 1619, the rivalry resulted in the Amboina Massacre, when several English company men were executed by agents of the Dutch. The event remained a source of English resentment for several decades, and indeed was used as a cause célèbre as late as the Second Anglo-Dutch War in the 1660s. Nevertheless, in the late 1620s the English company shifted its focus from Indonesia to India. In 1643, the Dutch West India Company established a settlement in the ruins of the Spanish settlement of Valdivia, in southern Chile. The purpose of the expedition was to gain a foothold on the west coast of the Americas, an area that was almost entirely under the control of Spain, and to extract gold from nearby mines. Uncooperative indigenous peoples, who had forced the Spanish to leave Valdivia in 1604, contributed to get the expedition to leave after some months of occupation. This occupation triggered the return of the Spanish to Valdivia and the building of one of the largest defensive complexes of colonial America. Africa. By the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch had overtaken Portugal as the dominant player in the spice and silk trade, and in 1652 founded a colony at Cape Town on the coast of South Africa, as a way station for its ships on the route between Europe and Asia. After the first settlers spread out around the company station, nomadic white livestock farmers, or trekboers, moved more widely afield, leaving the richer, but limited, farming lands of the coast for the drier interior tableland. In 1795, the heavily taxed Boers of the frontier districts, who received no protection against the Africans, expelled the officials of the Dutch East India Company, and established independent governments at Swellendam and at Graaf-Reinet. Rivalry with Great Britain and France. In 1651, the English Parliament passed the first of the Navigation Acts, which excluded Dutch shipping from the lucrative trade between England and its Caribbean colonies, and led directly to the outbreak of hostilities between the two countries the following year, the first of three Anglo-Dutch wars that would last on and off for 2 decades and slowly erode Dutch naval power to England's benefit. The Second Anglo-Dutch War was precipitated in 1664, when English forces moved to capture New Netherland. Under the Treaty of Breda, New Netherland was ceded to England in exchange for the English settlements in Suriname, which had been conquered by Dutch forces earlier that year. Though the Dutch would again take New Netherland in 1673, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, it was returned to England the following year, thereby ending the Dutch Empire in continental North America, but leaving behind a large Dutch community under English rule that persisted with its language, church and customs until the mid-18th century. In South America, the Dutch seized Cayenne from the French in 1658 and drove off a French attempt to retake it a year later. However, it was returned to France in 1664, since the colony proved to be unprofitable. It was recaptured by the Dutch in 1676, but was returned again a year later, this time permanently. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 saw the Dutch William of Orange ascend to the throne, and win the English, Scottish, and Irish crowns, ending 80 years of rivalry between the Netherlands and England, while the rivalry with France remained strong. During the American Revolutionary War, Britain declared war on the Netherlands, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, in which Britain seized the Dutch colony of Ceylon. Under the Peace of Paris, Ceylon was returned to the Netherlands and Negropatnam ceded to Britain.